December 7th, 1941. Japanese commanders celebrated their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor while mocking America's pathetic steel shortage and industrial weakness. But within 3 years, they watched in horror as America launched over 2,000 warships, including dozens of aircraft carriers from shipyards that seemed to multiply overnight. The same nation Japan thought was too weak to fight back had quietly become the most terrifying industrial war machine in human history. But how did America hide such massive production capability so well that even Japan's best intelligence networks never saw it coming? The morning sun painted Tokyo's government buildings golden on December 7th, 1941, as Admiral Yamamoto walked into the Naval Ministry with confident steps. Japan had just pulled off the most daring surprise attack in military history. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, American battleships sat on the ocean floor, and the Pacific belonged to the rising sun. In the meeting rooms, military leaders passed around reports and photographs, their faces bright with victory smiles. But underneath the celebration, something else was happening. Japanese intelligence officers had been studying America for months, and what they found made them laugh. American steel mills were struggling with strikes and worker problems. Factories that should have been making weapons were still producing cars and refrigerators. The mighty United States looked weak and unprepared, like a sleeping giant that would take years to wake up. Captain Suzuki spread the latest intelligence reports across the conference table. America had only 7 aircraft carriers compared to Japan's 10. Their army was small and scattered across the world. Most shocking of all, American steel production was actually falling behind schedule. The numbers seemed impossible to believe, but report after report confirmed the same thing. America simply did not have the industrial strength to fight a long war against Japan's experienced military machine. In the shipyards of Yokosuka, Japanese workers labored day and night to build new warships. Each vessel took months to complete, with craftsmen carefully welding every joint by hand. Steel was precious in Japan, rationed carefully, and used only for the most important military projects. Every ton had to be counted, every sheet had to serve a purpose. This was how real nations built their war machines, the admirals believed, with discipline and careful planning. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, something very different was taking shape. In places like Norfolk, Virginia, and San Francisco Bay, construction crews were working around the clock on mysterious new projects. Massive concrete foundations appeared overnight. Railroad tracks stretched toward the water. Local residents wondered what all the activity meant, but military censors kept the details secret. The Japanese intelligence network tried to keep track of American activities, but the reports they received seemed contradictory and confusing. Some sources claimed that American factories were expanding rapidly. Others insisted that steel shortages would cripple any major building projects. Photo reconnaissance flights showed construction activity, but the scale appeared modest compared to Japan's own industrial efforts. As winter turned to spring in 1942, Japanese victories continued to pile up. Singapore fell, the Philippines surrendered, and the Dutch East Indies came under Japanese control. Each success seemed to prove that America's industrial weakness was real. The enemy was too slow, too disorganized, too comfortable to mount a serious challenge. Yet in quiet moments, some Japanese officers wondered about the strange reports filtering back from their intelligence agents. American shipyards seemed unusually busy for a nation supposedly struggling with steel shortages. The question that would soon haunt them was simple but terrifying. What if everything they believed about American weakness was completely wrong? By late 1942, the first Japanese prisoners of war arrived at American camps, and what they saw made no sense. Lieutenant Tanaka had been captured at Guadalcanal, expecting to find a weak enemy struggling with basic supplies. Instead, guards served him meals with fresh meat, white bread, and portions larger than what Japanese officers ate back home. The prison camp kitchen was bigger than entire restaurants in Tokyo, with giant refrigerators humming constantly and cooks preparing food for thousands of men as if resources were endless. The prisoners watched in confusion as American supply trucks arrived daily, loaded with goods that seemed impossible. Cases of Coca-Cola bottles clinked as workers unloaded them. Ice cream arrived in frozen containers, a luxury most Japanese had never tasted even before the war. Fresh vegetables filled crates while back in Japan. Families rationed rice and ate sweet potatoes to survive. The contrast felt like looking into a different world, one where abundance replaced the careful counting of every grain and scrap. From his barracks window, Tanaka could see the nearby shipyard where American workers moved like ants around massive steel structures. The sound of welding torches never stopped, day or night. Bright sparks flew through the darkness as 3 shifts of workers kept the construction going around the clock. What shocked him most was the waste he witnessed. American workers threw away metal scraps that Japanese craftsmen would have saved and reused. Perfectly good steel plates sat in piles, waiting to be shaped into ship hulls. The numbers began to sink in when Tanaka overheard guards talking about production schedules. They mentioned launching 4 new destroyers in a single week from just one shipyard. Back in Japan, building 4 destroyers took months of careful work by master shipbuilders. Here, the Americans seemed to be stamping out warships like factory products, using assembly line methods that treated each vessel as just another piece of equipment rolling off the production floor. Intelligence reports smuggled back to Japan told an even more frightening story. American factories that had been making cars 6 months earlier were now producing tanks and aircraft engines. The Ford Motor Company alone was building more bombers than Japan's entire aircraft industry. Steel mills that Japanese spies had dismissed as outdated were melting down old cars and turning them into battleship armor at a rate that seemed impossible to believe. The most disturbing revelation came from prisoners who had worked in American factories before their capture. They described furnaces so large that entire Japanese steel plants could fit inside them. They talked about conveyor belts carrying materials at speeds that eliminated the careful handwork Japanese craftsmen took pride in. The American approach was not about quality craftsmanship, but about overwhelming quantity, producing 10 ships for everyone Japan could build. As 1943 dawned, the terrible truth was becoming clear to those willing to see it. America had not been weak during those early months of war. They had simply been changing from a nation that made consumer goods into a nation that made weapons of war. And the speed of that change was beyond anything Japan had thought possible. The breaking point came on a cold morning in January 1944 when Captain Suzuki received an intelligence report that made his hands shake. The numbers were so large he read them 3 times, certain there must be a mistake. American shipyards had launched 124 aircraft carriers in the past year alone. Not destroyers or cruisers, but full aircraft carriers, each one capable of carrying 90 fighter planes and bombers. In the same 12 months, Japan had managed to complete just 2 carriers, and both were smaller than the American ships. Suzuki walked to his office window and stared at the Tokyo harbor where Japan's remaining fleet sat anchored. He counted 7 aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, each one built with years of careful work by master craftsmen. Across the Pacific, American carriers were rolling off assembly lines faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from their decks. The steel shortage that Japanese leaders had mocked was revealed to be nothing more than a temporary pause while America transformed its entire industrial system into a war machine. The moment of complete understanding hit Suzuki like a physical blow when he read a prisoner report about visiting an American shipyard on Christmas Day. The Japanese prisoner described watching American workers take the day off to celebrate with their families, while automated machinery continued building ships without human hands. Even during holidays, American production never stopped. The prisoner wrote that he watched a crane lower a completed ship hull into the water. The 5th vessel launched that week from a single yard. In his private diary that night, Suzuki wrote words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. America had never been weak or unprepared for war. They had simply been choosing not to show their true strength. The peaceful nation that sold cars and radios to the world had been hiding the ability to build more weapons in 6 months than Japan could produce in 5 years. The industrial giant had been sleeping by choice, not from weakness, and Japan had made the fatal mistake of waking it up. The propaganda that had filled Japanese newspapers for months now seemed like dangerous lies. Stories about American weakness and lack of fighting spirit crumbled when faced with production numbers that defied imagination. American factories were not just making more ships and planes than Japan. They were making more than Japan could ever hope to build, even if the war lasted 20 years. The careful calculations that had convinced Japanese leaders they could win a quick war were based on completely false information about American capabilities. By spring 1944, the transformation in Japanese thinking was complete. Military leaders who had laughed at American industrial weakness now faced the terrifying reality that they had started a fight with the most powerful manufacturing nation in human history. The steel shortage they had mocked had become an avalanche of American warships flooding the Pacific, each one proof that Japan had never understood the true nature of the enemy they had chosen to attack. The transport ship carrying Captain Suzuki and other Japanese prisoners docked at Yokohama Harbor on a gray September morning in 1945. As he stepped onto the wooden pier, Suzuki barely recognized his homeland. The bustling port he remembered from 1941 had become a wasteland of twisted metal and broken concrete. American bombs had turned the mighty shipyards into empty shells. Their massive cranes toppled like fallen giants. The smell of smoke and rust filled the air, where the scent of fresh steel and ocean salt had once welcomed him home. Walking through the ruins of Tokyo, Suzuki carried with him a small notebook filled with sketches and numbers he had recorded during his captivity. Page after page showed diagrams of American factory assembly lines, measurements of ship construction speeds, and calculations that still seemed impossible to believe. In his coat pocket, he kept a single photograph given to him by an American guard, showing dozens of aircraft carriers lined up at Norfolk Naval Base like cars in a parking lot. The image represented more naval power than Japan had ever possessed in its entire history. The contrast between what Japan had achieved and what America had built struck him with fresh horror as he visited his old neighborhood. His family home had survived the bombing, but his wife greeted him with hollow cheeks and worn clothing that spoke of years of rationing and hunger. She served him a meal of rice mixed with barley and thin soup, the best food she could find after months of near starvation. He remembered the thick steaks and fresh bread served daily in American prison camps, meals that had been routine for captured enemies while Japanese families ate grass and tree bark to survive. At the Naval Ministry, now a bombed shell of its former self, Suzuki met with other surviving officers who had witnessed American industrial power firsthand. Commander Watanabe had been captured at Saipan and worked in an American aircraft factory, where he watched workers produce 12 bombers in a single day. Lieutenant Hayashi had seen American supply ships unload enough food and equipment in 1 hour to feed a Japanese division for a month. Each man carried stories that painted the same devastating picture of a nation whose industrial strength had been beyond Japanese imagination. The mental weight of these revelations pressed down on Suzuki as he tried to explain to his family what had really happened during the war. His teenage son asked why Japan had lost to a country they had surprised at Pearl Harbor. How could he explain that the surprise attack had been like a mosquito biting a sleeping dragon? Japan had celebrated destroying 8 old battleships, while America responded by building a fleet larger than all other nations combined. The steel shortage that Japanese leaders had mocked had lasted exactly as long as it took American industry to shift from making refrigerators to making aircraft carriers. Months passed as Suzuki watched American occupation forces arrive with endless streams of supplies and equipment. Trucks that seemed fresh from assembly lines delivered food, medicine, and building materials in quantities that dwarfed anything Japan had ever managed to transport. American soldiers wore uniforms that looked new and carried weapons that gleamed with perfect manufacturing. Even their trash contained items that would have been treasures in wartime Japan. Throwaway goods that revealed the casual abundance of a nation that could afford to waste more than Japan could produce. In quiet moments, Suzuki would open his notebook and stare at the production numbers he had recorded. America had built over 300 aircraft carriers during the war, more than 2,000 major warships, and nearly 300,000 aircraft. These were not the desperate efforts of a struggling nation, but the casual output of an industrial system that had been running at half speed before the war began. Japan had attacked a country that possessed the ability to outproduce the entire Axis alliance while simultaneously feeding its people better than they had eaten during peacetime. The final lesson came to Suzuki during a visit to Hiroshima, where he saw the ultimate expression of American industrial power. The atomic bomb represented not just advanced science, but the ability of American factories to produce the most complex weapon in human history, while simultaneously building the largest navy and air force the world had ever seen. Standing in the ruins of the city, he understood that Japan had never been fighting a war against American military forces alone, but against the entire American economy turning toward destruction. As he wrote his final diary entry that winter, Suzuki reflected on the terrible cost of misunderstanding an enemy's true strength. Japan had laughed at America's supposed weakness and paid for that laughter with complete defeat. The real tragedy was not that Japan had lost the war, but that the war never should have been fought at all. Any nation that could produce abundance in peacetime could produce overwhelming force in war, and Japan had learned this lesson only after it was far too late to matter.